So we will be continuing our study of what has been quite a long series now. When we are in fact in lesson number 129 of this series on Christian holiness, and we are dealing with what is called by some as little sins. May mga bagay na minamaliit natin at kung mamaliitin natin, madali na ipagwalang bahala. That is the danger of not pursuing holiness, is when we spare ourselves of any sin that we are not seeking to mortify. And so I made it very clear in our previous lesson, the right perspective when it comes to sin. There are those who will say that there are no differences when it comes to sin. Now, I understand and I even appreciate their intention is so that no one may belittle any sin, even if that is just thought or attitude. It is something that you must take seriously. I understand that. I even appreciate that. And their intention is for no one to belittle any sin. But let me tell you that because it is a wrong teaching, its effect is quite the opposite. Iisipin nyo na lang kung nag-iisip ka ng masama at pagkatapos dahil naturuan ka na wala namang pagkakaiba ang kasalanang iniisip kaysa sinasalita at ginagawa, salitain ko na rin o gawin ko na rin dahil hindi naman naiiba sa isip, and that is dangerous because what is in thought which is sinful will then worsen into actual speech or action. So what we did last week was, in summary, to show that there are degrees of gravity of sin. Some sins are worse, some sinners are worse. If you're seeing me looking upwards, may TV ako sa... Kaya doon ako nagbabasa. So there are degrees of gravity. Those degrees we can measure by knowledge, between the intentional and the unintentional. So, yung sinasadya dahil alam mo ng kasalanan, gagawin mo pa rin, mas mabigat yon kaysa sa ginawa mo at kasalanan yon, kasalanan pa rin kahit hindi mo alam. But if it is a violation of God's word, it is still sin. But in comparison, we saw how the intentional sin has greater gravity than unintentional sin. Then there are degrees measured by action. From the words of Jesus, that it begins with a thought and then it becomes words or action. The action, the external, begins with a thought. The thought itself is already sin, but when you make it something that is external, the external adds to the internal, so it becomes worse. And then there are degrees measured by harm. Who do you harm by your sin? From self-harm, you harm yourself, but at least no one else is involved. It's sin, but the greater sin is when it harms others as well. And the greatest of gravity of sins when it comes to harm is when the harm involves the damning of the soul. So the false teachings, the deceivers, and the impostors, they are the ones who will have the graver sin. And one thing that we stated as a principle is that the gravity of the offense is proportional to the favor of the offender. Pag mas may pabor ka, gaya ng naturuan, yan ay pabor ng Diyos, at pagkatapos ay patuloy ang iyong kasalanan, mas lumalaki rin ang iyong kasalanan kahit sabihin natin pareho ang kasalanang ginawa. Pero yung isa, wala namang pabor ng kaalaman, yung isa ay may pabor, the favor compounds the sin that is committed. However, this is the wording that I gave last week. While there are degrees of gravity of sins, there are no little sins. So we reject the idea of the Roman Catholic classification between mortal sins and venial sins. There are no venial sins. All sins lead to death. That's what the Bible tells us. Romans 6:23, the penalty of sin is death. So we are going to deal now with some of this. There are sins that we treat as little, and when you treat sin as little, oftentimes the result is that you are not serious about mortification. Hindi ka magiging seryoso na dapat patayin, tanggalin ang kasalanan na ito sa buhay natin. Hindi natin sinasabi that we will attain perfection. throughout our lifetime until we get to glory, we will be dealing with sin. But we should never treat any sin as something we can set aside because it's too little to bother about. Yun ang isang tandaan natin. So what are the little sins that we tend to set aside? And I identified 4 last week, but since then, some brethren have added more. Kaya there are now 6. We will begin with complaining, and then time wasting, boastfulness, laziness, disrespect. Yun yung 5 pala. 5 ang aking sinabi last week. But since then, 2 more have been added, and I'm adding impatience with a twist, a particular kind of impatience. And somebody also suggested, probably thinking of me, workaholism. So, so we will deal with that without holding any punches, whoever gets hit, so to speak. But we will begin with the fact of complaining, pag-angal, reklamo, or however you call it. But we are living in a complaining world where it is almost a must to show your victimhood in order to advance in the eyes of others is to consider yourself a victim. And no matter how light the thing that has been done to you, you already are a victim. Or if you cannot find anyone to blame, well, there's always the past generation to blame. So there are people who ask even for reparation because they want to blame the past generations for their condition today. So what is complaint? Complaint is the expression of grievance over perceived adversity. Yung pag ipinapahayag mo ang iyong hinanakit o kabigatan dahil sa iyong nararanasang pighati, that is complaint. Now let me begin by the positive, by saying that complaining as such is not wrong. Complaining may be right in a certain way. So we ask the question, when is complaining not wrong? Because we can see in scriptures the word complaining is used, but we cannot say that is wrong. One is in the case of complaint addressed to God for a certain reason. We see here the psalmist in Psalm 142 verse 2, I pour out my complaints before Him and tell Him my troubles. So dito makikita natin na ang salmista ay nagsasabi na ibinubuhos niya ang kanyang pag-angal sa Panginoon, at ang pag-angal na iyon ay bunga ng kanyang nakikitang ginagawa ng mga masasama laban sa kanyang pangalan. So in other words, this is complaint that is dictated by a sense of adversity that violates the honor of God. You cannot make that a wrong complaint when you complain before God because of an adversity, but the adversity is not so much because it hurts you. It may hurt you, but the major thing or the primary thing to you is that it violates the honor of God. And that is what we see in Psalm 142. I pour out my complaint before you, and it speaks of how the persecutors are proving to be too strong, and that they are therefore concluding that something is weak about his God who cannot help him. And the psalmist feels the harm of that as far as the honor of God is concerned. You can call this also zeal for God, or another language is jealousy for God. Jealousy in the sense that you do not want God's name to be blasphemed or God's name to be violated, and in that sense you complain. So this is complaining that is in the form of pleading in prayer. Sumasamo ka sa iyong panalangin. Kaya hindi ito yung paangal na isinisigaw mo sa mundo, kundi iyong itinatangis sa harap ng Diyos, isinasamo sa Kanya sa panalangin. So in this case, you cannot call it wrong. Complaint in this sense can even lead you to more prayer, to call upon the Lord. Then in another sense, complaint is not wrong where it is against abuse that is rendered to you by people who may be abusing you against without any cause or right reason or ground for that. This is the case of Paul. I'm not going to read the whole verse anymore, but this was what happened in Philippi. They imprisoned Paul and Silas without any hearing. They just imprisoned them, and then the following day, they were willing to set him free. And by this time, Lydia has already been converted, the Philippian jailer has already been converted along with their households. So the authorities are now ready to set him free, and Paul lodged a complaint. I am a Roman citizen, and you did something which is against a Roman citizen's rights. Hindi mo pwedeng gawin ang ganon sa isang Romano. And you can say, though the word complaint is not used, Paul is here complaining in the sense that he is saying that they have abused their authority against him or against them, put together with Silas. So Paul is asserting his Roman rights abused by the authorities there in Philippi. And you abuse a Roman citizen, that will be bad for you if that is heard by higher authorities. So the authorities here knew what fault they were done, and so they came to Paul in an apologetic approach. They apologized, in other words, for what they have done. One thing that we learned here is that one may use legitimate channels to assert rights being abused. So wag natin isipin na, wag kang aangal, kaya kahit na kung anong gawin sa'yo na abuso na, ay hindi ka pwedeng umangal o to lodge any complaint on right authorities, like suing or going to the authorities like the police or the administrator of an office. You can go to the proper channels, legitimate channels, to assert your rights that are being abused. So don't imagine that this topic on complaining is totally dismissing all kinds of complaining. There is a complaining that is not wrong in itself. But of course, you know why we are here. We are going to concentrate more on complaining that is often sinful. So when is complaining sinful? Kailan nagiging makasalanan ang pag-angal? Well, this time, tingnan natin sa dalawang bagay. Complaining against God Himself. Now, take note of the difference kanina. I said complaining that is addressed to God. That's different. You address your complaint to God because if it is right to complain to the right authorities of abuses, the highest authority is God, and therefore we can complain to Him. But this kind of complaining that is sinful is complaining against God Himself, and that is not a small thing. In fact, it is so serious that it is one of the reasons why the people, the Israelites in the wilderness, the story of the wilderness journey is one of continuing complaint. And when the people complained, sinabi ron, narinig ng Panginoon, the Lord heard it, and His anger was kindled. So His anger was aroused, and the judgment was on the part of God to judge the first generation. What happened? What we learn here is that God does not belittle complaining. It arouses His anger, and the penalty that was imposed on those complainants was it became the ground for the first generation's failure to enter Canaan. By the first generation, I mean the generation that exited Egypt. Lahat sila, with the exception of two, Joshua and Caleb, all the rest died in the wilderness. No one entered the promised land or Canaan. They died in the wilderness, and the ground for that is their complaining. So tell me if God belittles complaining. No, He does not. It provokes Him to anger. And by the way, just to digress, isang ibig sabihin yan, all the generation that entered Canaan to build a nation, with the exception again of Joshua and Caleb, were 40 years old and below. They were all born in the wilderness. 40 years sila sa wilderness. So they were all born in the wilderness, therefore they were all young. The United Nations defines youth as 40 and below. So lampas-lampasan na ang ilan sa atin doon. But that means you can build a nation through young people, and this is also telling us of the place of the youth. But this was the ground for the first generation not entering the promised land because of their constant complaint. Lahat na lang inaangal nila. Binigyan ng mana, pagkain daw yun ng mga anghel, kaya may pagkain sa langit. Pagkain daw yun ng mga anghel, umangal. Binigyan sila ng karne, umangal. Walang ginawa kundi maya't maya angal, grumbling. It was a grumbling generation. So that can be a case for a punishment of God, a chastisement in the case of believers. And let me tell you, when it comes to complaining against God, there is one attribute that is the most complained against as far as God is concerned, and that is His sovereignty. Na siya'y nakapangyayari, siya ang magpapasya. So when you begin to teach sovereign grace in terms of God electing those whom He will save among sinners, all of whom He could have damned without any diminishing of His justice, yet people complain. And when you say that out of His mercy He sent Christ so that He may die with a sure intention of saving those for whom He died, then again complaint. And when it comes to providence, more complaints. Why am I here in this kind of, why did God allow this to happen? And so we complain against providence. And Paul had that kind of complaint in mind about the sovereignty of God, like a potter forming the clay according to his will, and yet there is complaint, and Paul answers back, but who are you, O man, to talk back to God? And that talking back is complaining. Shall what is formed say to him who formed it, why did you make me like this? So it is a complaint that is thrown at the sovereignty of God. And how many times have we either consciously or perhaps inadvertently been complaining against God's sovereign ways? And we will see how that happens to us. But to complain against God is to belittle His redemptive goodness. Itong hindi nakikita ng Israelites. Alam nyo bang palagi nilang sinasabi, mabuti pang nandun kami sa Egypt. Doon, mura sibuyas. Hindi kagaya dito. I think yun lang, di ba, sinasabi nila, where there are onions, etc. Hindi nila nalilimutan ba nila? It was bondage. They were slaves in Egypt. Yes, they were fed, but fed as slaves. Now in the wilderness, they were free, and they are complaining. And what they are complaining against is that God set them free. Can you imagine how terrible this complaining is? As we have sung, we are making this complaint against one we sung and praised as bounteous God. napakamasagana ng ibinigay ng Diyos. Tapos sa angal, laban sa kanyang pagpapalaya sa kasalanan. Yan ang essence ng complaint ng Israelites. So, that's a sinful complaining against God. Then the second kind of complaining that is sinful is against one's lot. Meaning, yung kalagayan mo, yung naibigay o naitakda sa iyong buhay, we can complain against that. And a case in point here is the psalmist in Psalm 73, where he confesses how he had struggled with this in 13 and 14 of Psalm 73. Surely in vain I have kept my heart pure and washed my hands in innocence, for I have been stricken all day long and chastened every morning. Parang walang saysay na ako'y nagpakamatapat sa Diyos. Tapos makikita ko yung mga walang katapatan sa Diyos na tila sumasagana habang ako'y naghihikahos. Have you uttered, perhaps even in the whisper of your mind, that kind of complaining? Well, it tells us, it reminds us that even the righteous falls into this sin. The psalmist is a righteous man and seeking to be righteous, serious about righteousness, but what set him complaining is that compared to others who are not righteous but really wicked, but sila pang sumasagana. And what we learn here is the distinction between righteous and wicked leads to wrong expectation at this point, at least of the psalm. Tandaan natin yung sinabi ko last night, yesterday sa prayer meeting, when you think of a psalm, don't imagine that the psalmist was writing the psalm as he was experiencing it. It would have been sometimes years after the experience, and then he recalls it and he writes. So he was recalling the time that he was complaining, and the reason for that complaint is a wrong expectation. Parang katulad rin kay Job na nag-complain na siya naman ay matuwid at binuyo pa ng mga tinawag niyang miserable counselors na sinabi, kung ganyan ka naghihirap ay may kasalanan ka. So they are giving wrong expectation that if you're righteous, you should prosper and be blessed. And if you are wicked, you should be very hard in your life. And that is, of course, wrong. And yet this is a wrong expectation fed by false teachers of prosperity religion. And they are so many. And sometimes when I feel down about my ministry, why should I preach again? I watch some on YouTube of these false teachers just to hear them and make my blood boil, and I feel that I need to preach if this is the kind of preaching people hear. And yet this is the kind that is so prevalent today. They make you complain and they make you expect wrongly that if you are right with God, He will prosper you. That is deception, that is garbage, that is being fed to many of those who love to hear deception. Remember, the Lord remains sovereign in His allotment to the righteous and the wicked. Yes, it is right for you to follow the Lord. Be righteous as God enables you by grace. But don't imagine that because you are righteous, that you therefore deserve a lot that is much better, and many times measured externally, much better than the wicked. The Lord remains sovereign. But this is what we can expect. Whatever His sovereign allotment to His people, it is for their good. Yes, it is for your good. Well, but Pastor, you don't know. I'm making a mess of my life. There is something that I cannot do because I don't have much wherewithal. Do you mean to tell me the Lord has allowed that to happen? Yes. But the reason is lodged in His inscrutable wisdom. But many times, we want God to explain to us. And thus we complain because God won't many times explain. We just have, because if everything has an explanation to us, where's the place for trust? Ano pa ang puwang ng magtiwala kung lahat kailangang ipaliwanag? Bakit siya soberano kung kailangan niya magpaliwanag sa kanyang mga tagasunod? So, but this much you can rest assured if you are of the people of God. Whatever your allotment in life, mahirap, mayaman, nasa gitna, o naghihikahos, o ano paman, para ito sa iyong ikabubuti. Kung hindi mo pa alam paano ito makabubuti, ginagawa niya ang talagang mabuti. At ang talagang mabuti ay ang may kinalaman sa iyong relasyon sa Diyos, relasyon sa kanyang kaharian, sa kanyang mga tao, sa iyong gawain ng paglilingkod. Kaya lamang malimit sinusukat natin sa gaano tayo kasagana sa ating mga tinatangkilik. At kapag hindi tayo ganoon kasagana, ay doon tayo aangal na naging mabigat ang kamay ng Diyos sa akin. Which is wrong. It's like the Israelites who have all that God has provided to them on top of their liberation from Egypt and still found reasons to grumble. So this is sinful. And that is what we need to know. Now, what I want to say is, why should we not treat this as little? Complaining will have its aggravation. So, tandaan natin, and there are two ways of aggravation. It has the potential to grow worse. Hindi yan mananatiling angal lang sa iyong isip. Yan ay angal na lalago. And in what way? One is that it is infectious in company. Nakakahawa. Mas nakakahawa ito sa COVID. Kahit na anong mask gawin mo, papasok ang virus ng complaining. And it will infect. And this is what happened to the Israelites, in fact. So the man Moses had sent to explore the land, who returned and made the whole community grumble against him by spreading a bad report about it. So, 12 ang isinugo, 10 ang umangal, at ang resulta ng kanilang pag-angal, the whole community has become a complaining community. And perhaps you still do not realize, or some of you do not realize, why did they spend 40 years in the wilderness as a punishment? Because of the 40 days they spent in Canaan to spy, and when they returned, they complained. And God imposed the penalty 1 year for each day that you spent in Canaan. You're there, right there in the promised land. And instead of looking at God's promise, you saw something to grumble about. So instead of the short number of days that you could have arrived at the promised land, for each day you spent in that land of Canaan as spies, only to result in complaining. Each day is 1 year. 40 days they spend in Canaan. 40 years they spend in the wilderness. That's how big complaining is when it infects others. Hahawa ka ng iba. Pag tayo naman, pag may narinig na umangal, anong sagot natin? Siguro, kung tayo talagang spiritual sa ating pag-iisip, iwawasto natin ang taong yon. Pero madalas, umangal siya, dinagdagan pa natin. Hindi lang yan, ganito pa. Bumigat pang lalo yung inangal nung nag-umpisa. But it is infectious in company, and then it is erosive to rebellion. It will not remain complaining only of one particular experience. It will become, when it becomes a habit, it will become rebellion. And rebellion means total disregard, total defiance of God's authority. Maring minsan ay doon lang sa naranasan mo. O ba't hindi ako nakakuha ng mataas na grado? Nag-aral naman ako. Bakit halos pasang-awa lang? Uh, and then, maring yung pa lang, and then, the more you multiply your complaining, then it creates a habit, and the complaining will not stop just at complaining, it will become total rebellion. Remember, see how Jude lines up complaining with these other sins. These men are discontented grumblers. So he begins with that. Discontented grumbler. When you're grumbling, it's a matter of fact that you are in discontent. So discontented grumblers, following after their own lusts or desires, their mouths spew arrogance. They flatter others for their own advantage. So you see here a growing sin that begins with discontent expressed in grumbling, and then later on, it grows worse and worse. Ang ibig sabihin niyan, unmortified complaining worsens into open opposition to God. Huwag mong maliitin na simpleng angal lang ito, madali lang ito. Pag naulit-ulit yan, hindi mo mapapansin ay naghihimagsik ka na sa Panginoon. At maaaring makita yan sa paghihimagsik sa iglesia, paghihimagsik sa pangangaral ng salita, at nagsimula sa mga angal na hindi mo hinarap. And not only that it grows worse, it will cluster with other sins. Now, there are many sins that we could mention, but I'd like to mention three with which it clusters na dugtong ang pag-angal. Well, the first is gossip. Because complaining, by its definition, we defined it as expression of grievance. Now, when you express that grievance to someone, and oftentimes about someone, what is it? It's gossip. And gossip is one that has been put on the sophisticated level of technology in our day. Before, you only had to go to one person to gossip. We still do that. Today, you can just post it and be guilty of gossip with the whole world as your ears. And gossip should never be belittled. It is complaining of others that will resort to backbiting, and it is wrong at any time. It is worse when done against brethren. Kapag ginawa laban sa kapatiran, because meron tayong rules, meron tayong patakaran. That if someone has sinned against you, or so you think, go to him and deal with him one-on-one. But the others resort to backbiting, and here the psalmist shows the effect of it on the one who is the victim. All who hate me whisper against me. Ibig sabihin ng whisper dito, hindi sila nagbubulungan. Ibig sabihin, hindi pinaparinig. Hindi nila pinaparinig doon sa pinag-uusapan nila. So, maaaring yan ay text exchange or email or messenger or actual na conversation, pero ang net result ay hindi naririnig nung kanilang pinag-uusapan, ngunit maaring makarating sa kanya dahil sa ikinalat nga. So, etong naging conclusion ng psalmist, all who hate me whisper against me, they imagine the worst for me. You see, that's often the result of complaining. We impute the worst on someone when perhaps there is an explanation. But instead of looking for an explanation, which is the reason why it should be one-on-one, because you are after an explanation that may lead to reconciliation, but because we are after war, we look for an ally to whom we can pour out our complaint. And what does complaining do? Think of the worst of the person. And we become motive readers. and mind readers. And we are assuming that which belongs to God. So yan ang effect. Gossip is not a small sin. Gossip is condemned along with heinous sins. Then, envy. Complaining often is about what you do not have. What worsens it into envy is when complaining is because of God's favor on others. And that's what the psalmist admitted happened to him. Balik tayo sa Psalm 73, "For I envied the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked." So, complaining itself is you complain about your lot. Why do I have so little? But now it worsens into envy. Envy is looking at others and seeing that they are favored, they have what you do not have, and that makes you feel bad. That's envy, and envy is a worse sin. And that is because it now involves your complaining against, again, God's sovereignty, that in His allotment to different people, He allots differently. And sometimes He allots what you expect should not be allotted to the wicked, but God knows better, and it results in envy. And the last that I would use is already mentioned by Jude, discontent. Walang kakontentuhan, complaining of the littleness of blessing. Pinagpapala ka na nga, at kung iyon talagang susukatin ng pagpapala, lalo't simulan mo sa pinakatunay na pagpapala ng kaligtasan, we are now in our dogmatics in GMA, we are now dealing with salvation blessings. And there are many objective blessings of justification, reconciliation, adoption, subjective blessings of sanctification, perseverance of the saints, assurance of salvation. These are blessings which cannot be bought by any price. It was bought by the blood of the Lord Jesus. What tremendous blessings we have, but instead you count your money and it doesn't meet the standard that you have imposed on yourself, and you complain of the littleness of the blessings against the backdrop of so much blessing, which Hebrews 2 verse 3 says, that great salvation. Saan nanggagaling yung discontent na yan? Ay ingratitude. Kaya ang inawit natin ay paalala na now, thank we all our God because of the many blessings that we have received from Him. And the fact of His salvation, the fact of Jesus Christ, there can be no greater favor than the blessing of Christ. And remember that if God withholds, you must put it in the perspective of He did not withhold the best. Romans 8:32, He who spared not His own Son, but delivered Him up for us all, how should He not, or why should He not freely give us all things? If it is good for us, He will give us all things. But the fact is, it is many times bad for us. And in His fatherly love, He withholds. And we take it with discontent. That's ingratitude. And the other is entitlement. We live in a world of entitlement. Even the jobless, deliberate joblessness. I don't mean the jobless as victims, but those who do not choose to work. They too feel entitled that the government owes them. And the Bible says, he who will not work should not eat. And yet, we are raising a generation of young people whose main idea of life is they are entitled to its favors. I mean, I'm an old man by definition, not in spirit, but I belong to that old school that believes you work hard for whatever you gain in life. You work for it, you sweat for it, because that's what God said we should do. By the sweat of your brow, you will eat from the fruit of the soil. So that's how I was bred. Money did not come free. It was something we worked for. And I had to sell newspapers just to keep the means I need. Today's young people are growing up with a sense that the world owes them. And that is something that we need to reverse. Complaining does not remain singular. It will multiply more sins. I just chose these three, but I can cite more. When you begin to complain, there will be more to come. So, let me suggest that we make this reflection when we are in this temptation of complaining. First, ask, is my grievance the aftermath of my sin? Lamentations 3:39, remember this was the time the Israelites were now, after so many warnings by Jeremiah, even to weeping, they still went on in their sin, and now they are in captivity. And Lamentations 3:39 says, why should a living man complain, a man, about the punishment of his sins? Ba't ka aangal sa binalaan ka na at pagkatapos tinuloy mo pa rin ngayong ikaw ay pinarurusahan ng nararapat, bakit ka aangal? So reflect on that, then withdraw complaint. That's the response. If you realize that I'm in this mess because of my sin, then withdraw complaint. Then ask, what doctrine applies to my personal grievance? Anong katuruan ang aangkop sa aking pinagdaraan ng kabigatan? And Isaiah 29:24 says, those also who erred in spirit will come to understanding, and those who complained will learn doctrine. That's the New King James translation. This is about the Messianic age, that through the Messiah, God's people who once were complainers will learn doctrine. So one way to address your complaint is learn more the scriptures. Learn the doctrine of God's providence. Learn the doctrine of God's sovereignty. Learn the doctrine of God's grace, that whatever favor you receive, whether common or saving, is out of the undeserved favor of God. Then answer your complaint. And then final reflection is, how should I honor God amidst a complaining world? For we live in a complaining world. When you marry a prince, you still complain and feel yourself a victim. Therefore, when you reflect on this, kanina, withdraw your complaint, then answer your complaint, now reverse your complaint. What is the reverse of complaint? Thankful. The two cannot dwell together in the same heart. And I'd like to stress that Philippians 2:14 and 15, because it sets the contrast. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky. Oh, what a beautiful description of the Christian when he has a good testimony. But how is one to have a good testimony? Begin with your grumbling. When your office mates begin to grumble about the boss or about your salary, don't join, or at least inject a different thought that will lead to thankfulness. Then you will shine in your testimony. That's how Christians should be different from this complaining world. So let me conclude with the right thought is to think that complaining is a serious offense against God, who is sovereign and good to His people, including myself. So combine the two, sovereign and good. Sovereign, hayaan mo siyang magpasya. at ang pagpapasya niya para sa kanyang mga tagasunod ay mabuti. It will result in the resolve, I will mortify the thoughts of complaining and will watch that they will not worsen into words and rebellion. So, doon pa lang sa isip ay supilin mo na. That thought that is the result of remaining sin thinks there are so many valid grievances in my life that complaining is just be expected. It is to be considered just a little sin. Yan na nga ang nangyayari sa iba, minamaliit. Lahat naman talaga umaangal. Buksan mong TV, angal. Buksan mong internet, angal. Buksan mong messenger, angal. Buksan mong text mo, angal. Magbasa ka na lang ng book, angal pa rin. It's everywhere. So, and this will lead to the wrong habit. I will complain just to give outlet to my emotion, and that will probably ease my grievance. May mga ganyan mag-isip. Iaangal ko na lang para pag naihinga ko na, magaang ang damdamin ko. Ang hindi nila alam, inihinga nila, pero dahil hindi nila inihinga sa Diyos, kundi sa kapwa, pag nag-iisa na sila, yung inihinga nila ay parami ng parami. Dahil sa mali nila, inihinga ang kanilang angal. So my challenge is fill your minds with matters to thank the Lord for. Then express them. Just as complaining is expression, have a counter-expression. And the counter-expression is thanksgiving. And my last verse is James 5 verse 9. Do not make complaints against one another, brothers, so as not to be brought to judgment yourselves. The judge is already to be seen, waiting at the gates. So think of the judgment day. Do you think you can ever complain against God before His judgment? Panginoon, kulang yung binigay mo eh. Kung nabigyan lang ako ng sapat, mas makakapamuhay ako ng makadiyos. Can anyone say that? So think of the judgment day. Then you will realize, no, there's nothing to complain about.